Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 223 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. The Ohio River Valley encompasses a wide area that stretches nearly 1,000 miles between Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Cairo, Illinois. Now, during the 17th and 18th centuries, you would have found this region to be a rich agrarian region, where lots of different Native American peoples prospered from the land, both because they were able to produce a wide variety of crops from its rich soils, and because the land produced a variety of small fur-bearing animals that Native Americans were able to use in the fur trade. Now, it was the fur trade that brought the French and the British into the region, but it was the region's lush and fertile landscape that brought the Americans. Today, we're going to explore the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region as they were during the 17th and 18th centuries, as Native American spaces. We're also going to explore how those spaces changed over time as different European and American peoples came into those spaces and attempted to alter their ways of life. Guiding our exploration is Susan Sleeper Smith, a professor of history at Michigan State University and the interim director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. Susan has published 5 books, and her most recent book, Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, Indian Women and the Ohio River Valley, 1690 to 1792, offers us the chance to better understand the early American history of these really important regions. So, as we venture into the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region during the 17th and 18th centuries, Susan reveals why the Ohio River Valley proved to be such a unique, lush, and fertile area for agriculture, the role of the fur trades in connecting the Ohio River Valley with the Great Lakes region, and how American conquest of the region altered the region's prosperity after the American Revolution. But first, podcasts have really seemed to become a mainstream media these days. It seems no matter where you look, someone is writing about or talking about a podcast. Still, even with all of this attention, did you know that the best way to find a new podcast is still by word-of-mouth recommendation? The advice of friends and family really sticks with us. So please be a good friend and family member and tell the people in your life about your favorite podcasts. And if you really enjoyed this podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you would help me spread the word about it. So please tell your friends, family, and anyone else you meet about Ben Franklin's World. All right. Are you ready to visit the spaces Native Americans created in the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region during the 17th and 18th centuries? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history at Michigan State University. Presently, she's serving as the interim director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. She's written numerous articles and 5 books, including Indian Women and French Men, Rethinking Cultural Encounter in the Western Great Lakes, and, most recently, Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, Indian Women of the Ohio River Valley, 1690 to 1792. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Susan Sleeper Smith.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And we're happy to have you. Now, in Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, Susan focuses on Native American life in the Ohio River Valley. Susan, would you tell us about the Ohio River Valley and who lived there between the late 17th and early 18th centuries?
Let me kind of start by telling you about the people that live there. Sometimes it's designated as a very sparsely settled place, but it actually was very populous with an increasing number of American Indians moving and pushing west, and also natural increase, both the 17th and 18th century. The largest groups were really the Miami, the Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Potawatomi, but there were numerous smaller groups, often the Wea, the Mascoutin, the Kickapoo, the Fox, the Illinois, lived together fairly close in villages in the western half of the river valley. There were also Mohican and Wendat that lived in the eastern half. In addition, you have Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga. These are often called the Mingos of the Glades. They're splinter groups off of the Haudenosaunee. You have Chickamauga, Cherokee from the south. You have Nanacoke from Potomac Bay. You have a large number of Scots-Irish traders who are often referred to as British. You have a lot of French traders who have been there since the late 17th century. You have large numbers of white captives, you have white Indians, and you have escaped slaves. So a very diverse and fairly extensive population.
Yeah, it sounds like a really cosmopolitan place. So when we go to find the Ohio River Valley on a map, where on that map are we looking for the valley, and just how much area would we see the valley encompassing?
I think the easiest way to judge the size of the area is to imagine that the Ohio River Valley, which starts around present-day Pittsburgh and goes all the way to Cairo, Illinois, is almost 1,000 miles long. Most of the population lives north of the Ohio, and north of the Ohio are two of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Huron. And between the lakes and the river valley are all of the tributary rivers along with most Native American people live.
Now, what was life like in the Ohio River Valley during the 17th and 18th centuries? Would you tell us something about its environment and the plants and animals that also called that region home?
Well, this is a region that's really characterized by a multiplicity of sedentary agrarian villages. Most of those villages are located along the tributary rivers. There are also indigenous central trading towns that emerge along the Wabash at Weotenon, Miamitown, and at the confluence of the Maumee and Miami rivers, and also along the Glades at Sandusky along Lake Erie. It's a fairly unique landscape. It's a highly fertile landscape. It actually has a climate with two growing seasons, which often make it possible to plant crops twice during the year. It has extensive forest lands. It has long stretches of prairie grass, primarily south of the Ohio. But most of all, it's characterized by extensive wetlands and swamps. Let me just talk a moment about the Ohio River Valley, because I think the Ohio River is unlike any other tributary of the Mississippi. It is not only very long, but in its natural state, it was often shallow enough in some sections for people to walk across the river and for bison to migrate across the river during the summer months. Its natural level is, or was, only 3 to 20 feet high. Later, it was dammed. It's the tributary rivers north of the Ohio that link it to the Great Lakes, Lake Erie to the north and Lake Michigan to the west. And it's the tributary rivers that carry people from the north into the grasslands of the south. South of the Ohio is one of the richest hunting grounds in the continent. You find people from the south, the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Cherokee hunting just south of the Ohio. They're joined by the Haudenosaunee and all the numerous people that I've mentioned. Most of the villages are located along the tributary rivers. They're often located in what we call oak openings, which are dry lands devoid of trees and often covered by short prairie grasses. Many are naturally occurring openings. Others are created by indigenous men who girdled the trees and fired the lands. Villages are generally adjoined by original growth forests, which is the domain of wild animals. Hunting was the province of men, and this provides a source of meat and also probably nuts and berries that Indian women gather in the fall. One more thing about these villages, they're often near wetlands, which is crucial to household diets because Indian women harvested naturally occurring foods from the wetlands. It provided a large percentage of Indian diets, as much perhaps as 60% of the entire household. You may note that at the intersection of many of the small streams, Indian women planted the seeds of fruit trees where they were often allowed to grow wild. When they were planted in villages, indigenous women often cultivated the fruit trees and grew them adjacent to their vegetable gardens. Most of the cornfields were located along the river bottoms. There was a reason for this. The floodwaters in the spring replenished them with fertile soil. So this is not a landscape defined by vast territories of Native people, but rather by a multiplicity of indigenous villages, many of which were interethnic, created through intermarriage, or multi-ethnic. In other words, Miami Town was a place where the Delaware, the Miami, and the Shawnee also had major villages, and they lived in close proximity to each other. So one of the most important ways in which you might think of these villages is as sedentary villages. They do not move because their fields are annually replenished. There is no need for them to constantly move. In addition, often men do leave for the winter, but primarily to hunt not far from home, just south of the Ohio.
Wow. You've described an area and landscape that almost sounds something like an agricultural paradise. Now, the description you just gave us, plus details from your book, Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, reveal that you happen to know a lot about the 17th and 18th century agriculture of the Ohio River Valley. But as environments and landscapes change over time, I wonder if you would tell us a bit about how you can know so much about the agriculture of this region during those previous centuries. I mean, how do you know what you know about the 17th and 18th century Ohio River Valley?
Well, probably 10 years of doing research will tell you a lot, but I've managed to use sources that have been around for a long time, often reading against the grain. One of the things that's very interesting about the French literature, a lot of this literature is very descriptive of agrarian work. When it's translated into English, while the French clearly distinguish when they say they, whether it's male or female, later English translators, particularly Americans, paid no attention. And so much of what was very clearly women's work in the French literature is lost in translation for the Americans. So a lot of this means going back and reading extensive amounts of French literature. I also owe a great amount to people who have really worked on indigenous agriculture. Jane Mount Pleasant, who is at Cornell, has written extensively about the use of plows and what happens to productivity when settlers come in and use plows. She has recreated at Cornell the gardens and the cornfields of Native women, the Haudenosaunee women, and those same practices are followed in the Ohio River Valley. One of the things we know today from people who are agriculturalists who work on agrarian issues is that what Indian people were doing by not plowing the land meant that you had the highest crop yields over the longest period of time. You don't defertilize the land. Second of all, I think that what has been done with environmental history of people going back and recreating what the Ohio River Valley looked like before we started damming it, before we filled in the Black Swamp, which was 120 miles long, which was then completely filled in, filling in the wetlands of the Ohio River Valley. This has remarkably changed the landscape. And to peel back those layers of settlement and to come back to what this world looked like in the 17th and the 18th century is what provides you a very different understanding of this region.
Now, earlier you mentioned that Native American women planted European fruit trees in the Ohio River Valley. And you also mentioned the importance of French historical sources about this region to your work. And this has me wondering, when did Europeans start visiting and settling in this region, and how did they arrive there?
Well, there's not an extensive number of Europeans that arrive in the Ohio River Valley until the beginning of the 18th century. And even then, it's very few Europeans. It's mostly Frenchmen. Some Frenchmen begin to arrive at the end of the 17th century and early 18th century. This is a period at which, from 1696, for almost 20 years, the French banned the Western trade in furs. And as a result, many Indian people moved not from Green Bay, where they had been living because of the trading, back into the Ohio River Valley. And as they did, many of the Frenchmen that they were trading with chose to remain illegally in the West and moved into the Ohio River Valley, some in the late 1690s, but the majority in the early 1700s. Frenchmen also begin to appear in the Great Lakes when Detroit is founded in the early 1700s. At the same time, Englishmen from Albany, which was formerly Fort Orange, also are trading in the Ohio River Valley. Not extensively, really just probably a handful of British traders and no more than 2 or 3 dozen Frenchmen. But the population in the Ohio River Valley is primarily indigenous and is probably 10 to 15,000 people during this early 18th century, and probably even more than that. So these are a few Europeans in an indigenous world.
You know, one aspect of indigenous prosperity in American conquest that I found really striking, and that has also come up during our conversation, is that it sounds like women were central to the agricultural vitality of the Ohio River Valley peoples, and possibly even to their cultures. And what I'm thinking about now is how you said that French traders were intermarrying with indigenous women. So I wonder, did indigenous women play a vital role in sustaining and conveying the cultures of their peoples as time went on?
Yes, they do. First of all, when you have an agrarian society, unlike Western society, Indian women are the agriculturalists. And in the Ohio River Valley, they are not only growing things like corn along the river bottoms, but they are growing the whole triumvirate of Indian foods. They also have extensive vegetable gardens. They grow a lot of squash. They grow a lot of gourds. Indian women are also harvesting tremendous numbers of naturally occurring plants from the wetlands, which is why the Ohio River Valley is so important to indigenous people. It is the wetlands that also attracts them. Women, they are the givers of life, therefore they do not kill, and it's the men who hunted and provided the protein necessary to maintaining a healthy household. There are a tremendous variety of fish in the Ohio River, as well as in the tributary rivers, and Indian men fish. They also clear the fields. They fire the surrounding villages in the late fall to encourage plant growth in the spring and attract animals. But it's women that grow the majority of the produce that are consumed by the households, that also gather that produce. Women are also the processors of furs. When the fur trade really starts to become very prosperous, it's women that also begin to control that exchange process. So women occupy a very important place in the Ohio River Valley. They are the ones responsible for creating the sedentary agrarian landscape.
Speaking of the fur trade, you also mentioned Green Bay, that many of the Native American peoples who would come to live in the Ohio River Valley first lived in Green Bay. Would you tell us about Green Bay during this period, about the peoples who lived there and its connection with the Ohio River Valley?
Yes, Green Bay is a very attractive region. In 1660, Radisson will return from that area to Montreal with 60 canoe loads of peltry, the richest harvesting of peltry that had occurred in Montreal. It is not very long until Frenchmen simply left Montreal and fled west in pursuit of furs. And 2 of the fur trading centers at that time were Green Bay and Michilimackinac. Green Bay is much more attractive to people from the Ohio River Valley. And as French fur traders move into Green Bay, Indian people from the Ohio River Valley are drawn there in pursuit of European trade goods. And the population at Green Bay had been there. It's a pre-contact trading site. Green Bay had been there a very long time with a fairly extensive population. That population mushroomed when French fur traders arrived. And so why Green Bay? Well, Green Bay is quite similar to the Ohio River Valley. It has very fertile fields. It's surrounded by rich fishing territory, as rich almost as the Ohio River Valley in terms of fish. It is got a number of river valleys where the low-lying fields are places that are prime growing places for cornfields. So Green Bay provides some similarity to the Ohio River Valley, which makes it very attractive.
Okay, so now you've mentioned Green Bay, Detroit and Michilimackinac, and Albany. And when you think about the locations of these settlements, we are talking about an area that stretches from New York to Michigan to Wisconsin, which makes the fur trade seem really big and really spread out. So I wonder if you would tell us more about this trade and what expectations Native Americans, their French trading partners, and perhaps other European and colonial trading partners would have had for this trade.
The French fur trade, particularly during the early years of the French colony, really sustains it. And that initial fur trade often consisted of the Huron transporting furs from the Great Lakes to Montreal. When in the 1640s the fur trade wars start, the Huron are dispersed. The French would have preferred that native people continued to bring their furs to Montreal, but native people were often unwilling to tangle with the Iroquois. And as a result, French traders, particularly following Radisson's voyage into the West, the French traders take the place of needing to go to Montreal. And this French trade, when we're talking about it, Green Bay is a gathering place for native people. So it brings furs from different parts of the country to the west to Green Bay. In addition, Michilimackinac is the crossroads for furs in the northern Great Lakes. It extends far west into the Lake of the Woods, into Ojibwa territory. The Odawa, which are along the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, are primary transporters of furs. Mike McDonald's Masters of Empire makes this very clear. All of the Great Lakes is a rich place for furs, and it's not just beaver. The fur trade is much more than that. Primarily, it's beaver that the French and the British are interested in. But as those markets become glutted, overflowing with those furs, it's the furs that indigenous people retrieve from the wetlands in the Ohio River Valley and from the Great Black Swamp, otter, black raccoon, regular raccoon, muskrat. These are the furs that are used to trim the garments of wealthy people in Europe. So the fur trade extends from the eastern shore of the Great Lakes throughout the entire Great Lakes Basin and well into what is the present-day Canadian Northwest. And the fur trade is so extensive, people don't just leave in the spring and come back in the fall. Almost all traders that go into the Great Lakes are there for at least 18 to 24 months before they return to Montreal. That fur trade becomes so extensive that some fur traders simply relocate to the Western Great Lakes, marry into indigenous families because they have a built-in series of suppliers, their wife's kin. But in addition, all of these traders are not transitory. Many of them come back year after year to trade with the same people. This is a huge trade. It is probably responsible for financially floating New France until it falls to the British.
It really sounds like the fur trade was very lucrative for the French. And yet, you mentioned earlier that in 1697, King Louis XIV closed the French posts in Green Bay and banned all French fur trading activities in the West. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I'd love for us to find out why King Louis XIV closed the French fur trade. The early American history of the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region is truly fascinating. And to think, a lot of what we know about this region comes from scholars who have worked to recreate the agriculture of the past and from the French Historical Archive. Now, it's really important that there are archives and organizations that preserve, protect, and make available the records of the past. Not only does their work ensure that current and future scholars will be able to use the historical records to seek answers to their questions about the past, but it also ensures that we'll have well-informed books to read, exhibits to see, and podcasts to hear. Essentially, it means we'll continue to have access to well-researched histories. So before we rejoin Susan to find out why the French halted its fur trade in 1697, I wanted to tell you about an organization that is helping to ensure that we have access to important records about the past, the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. The Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York, was founded in 2011 to facilitate the study of Thomas Paine's writing, life, and legacy. The Institute supports research and educational initiatives, digital projects, exhibits, and hosts conferences and workshops. It also houses the Thomas Paine National Historical Association collection and the Lapidus collection, rich collections of writings and other items by and about Thomas Paine. So, given that the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies undertakes such interesting and important work and hosts interesting events, I thought you might want to follow them on Twitter at the ITPS so that you can stay more well-informed about their good work. Again, if Thomas Paine and work about Paine in early America are of interest to you, follow the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies on Twitter at the ITPS. Susan, if the fur trade was so lucrative for the French, why did King Louis XIV close the trade? And what did closing the fur trade mean for all the different Native American peoples who had traded with the French?
First of all, he bans the trade because Frontenac, when he was governor, who intended to profit himself handsomely from the trade, sent out as many French fur traders as he could locate. What happened is because the French fur trade operated much differently than the British fur trade, it was a royal monopoly, the Company of the Farm. And the Company of the Farm had to buy every single piece of peltry that came its way, whether it was good peltry or bad peltry. What happened was that within a very short period of time, within 5 or 6 years, Frontenac and the Company of the Farm had more furs than they could supply to the French market. And to save the Company of the Farm, indigenous people don't figure into this equation, but to save the Company of the Farm, the French king and Versailles closed the French trade. It's a shock. It's an incredible shock to Native people. English goods had become a very important part. You didn't cut off the trade and Indian people began to starve to death. That's not what the trade was like. The trade was a trade in cloth, manufactured cloth. But when they closed Green Bay and there were no fur trade goods being transported into the Western Great Lakes, Indian people slowly moved back into the Ohio River Valley. That migration increased throughout the 18th century. And the truth of the matter was, if there were no French to trade with, they were simply going to trade with the British. The Ohio River Valley and its tributary rivers take them into the southern Appalachias where there are extensive trading posts. New Orleans begins to open. Indigenous people in the Ohio River Valley are trading with traders from New Orleans. They're bringing their furs there. They're still bringing their furs to Montreal, but not nearly at the same rate. So it's the British that really begin to make a serious incursion with British trade goods.
It's really curious to me that you describe the fur trade as a trade in commercial cloth. And I find this really interesting because many scholars describe the fur trade as a trade in guns and alcohol. They really describe it as a bad trade for Native Americans. So would you tell us more about how you see the fur trade as a trade in commercial cloth rather than as a trade for guns and alcohol? And whether you see this trade as something that was bad or possibly even good for Native Americans?
Yes. And I don't want to paint the fur trade so that it's a completely rosy picture. But there are two different types of fur trades. The fur trade, which exists in the beaver trade, which produces probably the richest furs that come from the Northwest, and particularly from the Ojibwa people. This is a beaver trade. That trade does often have detrimental effects on Indigenous people. But the trade that exists in the Ohio River Valley is really completely different. It doesn't mean that the trade goods coming in are different, but it means that in the Ohio River Valley, they're able to supply the types of furs that are in the highest demand. And these are things like otter and the smaller animals. How do we know what the fur trade looked like? Well, one of the most interesting series of records are the French records. And the Montreal merchants' records tracked every single trade good transported by the French into the Great Lakes. So this is everything that came into the Great Lakes. And if you look at those records from 1750 to 1760, you will find that the amount of trade cloth coming into the Great Lakes is overwhelming. So for instance, at Detroit, over 75% of the trade goods coming in are cloth. At Weotanon, which is on the Wabash River Valley, over 55% of the trade goods coming in are cloth. Green Bay, over 65% of the goods coming in are cloth. Now, there are other goods coming in, but they come in far lesser numbers. So, for instance, at Detroit, all of the tools brought in for hunting, so this is steel traps, anything that would relate to hunting activities. Cloth is over 75%. Hunting materials is less than 12%. If the people who claim that the fur trade is the alcohol trade and that Indigenous people become addicted to alcohol, they really need to look at what's coming into the Great Lakes. In every trade post in the Western Great Lakes, alcohol being brought in is less than 5%. So these are accurate figures. These are not imagined figures. And often, if you check the sources for people that say guns and alcohol are the primary trade goods, they are not looking at the actual invoices of the goods that come into the Great Lakes. Weapons, for instance, coming in to Detroit, Weotanon, and Green Bay are less than 1%. And if you think about it, you really do not want to shoot an otter with a gun. There would be nothing left of the pelt. So this is a fur trade in small animals. There is not a need for guns to hunt animals. So what you find is the type of trading that goes on is a trade in small animals, not larger deerskins. This is a different type of trade. This is a southern fur trade. So with that in mind, I would challenge anyone who thinks that the fur trade in the southern Great Lakes led to alcoholism. I would say that in the 19th century, alcohol under the British becomes an increasingly frequent part of the trade, and I might blame the British for some of the alcoholism that begins to appear in the Great Lakes, but I would not blame the French.
Wow, I had no idea that there was that much cloth in the Great Lakes fur trade. Would you tell us more about the cloth that was being traded? I mean, what kinds of cloth were Native Americans interested in acquiring for their small animal peltry?
Well, let me ask you a question, Liz. Have you ever tried to sew anything on an animal skin?
No. Come to think of it, I have not ever tried that.
Have you ever tried to sew a piece of cloth?
Yes, I have tried sewing cloth, and I didn't think it was really that hard to do.
Yes. And so, because women are responsible for clothing the families, the fur trade very quickly moves into the cloth trade. And there's a very clear understanding for that. Faced with using animal skins, and they are still used, they are certainly used in the winter to protect you and to act as waterproof garments. But European cloth, which is very heavy, particularly strouds, are much easier to sew, much easier to make into clothing. And some of this cloth is not just English strouds, which are a highly desirable cloth, but in the southern Great Lakes, where people wear a lot of cotton during the summer months, calico becomes one of the most frequent trade goods. And long sheets of calico, often indigenous women dyed this cloth. They preferred certain colors. They often would not trade if the colors were right or if they could not adequately re-dye the cloth. This is women's work. All of the clothing that gets made is the work of women. And so women, frankly, were more than willing to trade the furs that they were processing for cloth. And so this is why it becomes probably the cloth trade and not the fur trade in the southern Great Lakes.
Okay, so now we know that the people of Green Bay and the Ohio River Valley regions really wanted cloth for their furs. And we also know that the French closed their fur trade in 1697 and that it remained closed for about 30 years. In the meantime, many Native American peoples trade with the British. But Susan, what happened when the French reopened their fur trade during the 18th century? What were the dynamics of this old and yet seemingly new trade?
Well, the French, as I mentioned, opened Detroit in the 1700s. They had hoped to deter the Indians from trading with the British. This occurs to some extent, provided the French begin to supply trade goods that indigenous people want. When the fur trade is once again opened, increasing numbers of French men move into the Western Great Lakes. Many of them move into the beaver trade in the Northwest. They often have families there. Not as many move into the Southern Great Lakes. There you're going to find more Scots-Irish traders, the British intruding on the French trade. The Frenchmen that were there had married into indigenous families. Some of them had resettled at Detroit with other French families, and you find an increasingly large growing community of French people in the Great Lakes. But even by 1760, at the 7 Years' War, there's really no more than 700 or 800 people at Detroit. So there's never really a very large number of Frenchmen. What is different about the French than the British, and why the French remain desirable traders north of the Ohio River and south of the Great Lakes, is because they often give out their trade goods at the beginning of the hunt. So in other words, when Indians often go off for the hunting season, and not all Indians do, villages remain populated, but those that go off take their trade goods with them, leave some of the other cloth in the villages for women to work on during the winter months. But basically what happens is the French then collect the furs in the spring when the Indians return. So for the French and indigenous people, a different type of more integrated fur trade begins to evolve. This is less so for the Scots-Irish or for the British traders coming in, but to a great extent, even those traders are very dependent on soliciting indigenous customers. So you have traders, for instance, like John Askin, who comes in right around the time of the 7 Years' War. He can't break into the trade. It's still controlled by the French. Even after the fall of Canada. It's still controlled by the French on the ground. Askin buys an Indian slave, marries her. She knows the trade. That's his entree into the trade. For a very long time, throughout a good part of the 18th century, entree into the trade is established by either intermarriage with indigenous women or with setting up trading alliances with individual communities in the Ohio River Valley.
Since you mentioned the 7 Years' War, I wonder if you could tell us what happened to these different trading alliances after that war ended in 1763. Because at that point, the French really had to cede all their territory in North America to Great Britain. So, at least on paper, it would really seem to be the case that the British were the only trading partners in town.
Yes, it does seem like that. In fact, the British were confident they were the only traders in town. And when they stationed military men at each of their outposts, the indigenous people responded by being led by Pontiac, who managed to unite many indigenous people who had no interest in being dominated by the British. And you have Pontiac's rebellion. You find 12 forts under siege by Indians. You find that 8 forts in the Great Lakes fell to Pontiac's followers. You find that there is not a fur trade post west of Fort Niagara that remains in British hands. The closest one is Detroit, and it remains under siege for 4 months. So how did the indigenous people respond to the invasion of the British? By repelling them. And it's very simple. The British learn a very clear lesson, and they attempt to do 2 things. The first thing they do is eventually they're going to set up, quote, a proclamation line declaring that this is Indian country and that the British colonists should not pass that proclamation line. What the colonists do is, of course, another story, but the British really do attempt to maintain control from a distance. They do not create posts like those at Albany, where indigenous people must bring their furs to trade. That's not true. What the British learn is to leave the French traders intact. The British will take over management of the fur trade, but they will leave all of the French traders in indigenous villages. British traders are forced to compete with the French on the ground, even though this is now, quote, on a map, British territory.
And I think this is a really good place for us to segue in our conversation, because thus far, we've been really focused on the idea of the indigenous prosperity of these regions. I mean, we've been talking about a cosmopolitan and culturally rich area, given all the different peoples who live there, lush, fertile farm and swamplands that grew all sorts of crops and fruit trees, and a dynamic and vibrant fur and cloth trade. But the other half of Susan's book title is American Conquest. So Susan, would you tell us what happened to this region, its people, and all of its prosperity after the American Revolution? I mean, what happened when Americans really started flooding over that proclamation line?
This is probably the saddest part of my book. What happens is during the Revolutionary War, George Rogers Clark will capture Vincennes. Indigenous people were not really very active in the Revolutionary War. They did not favor the Americans. They did not really favor the British. You find at Michilimackinac some indigenous people really fighting on the side of the British, but this is not true in the Ohio River Valley. When George Rogers Clark captures Vincennes, in hindsight, one wishes that indigenous people had stopped him, that he had not come in, but they did not stop him. His manner of capturing Vincennes was to raise militia from the Virginia backcountry. These were often very poor people who were fighting alongside Clark because by going to the west, they had access to new fertile farmland surrounding Vincennes. They also joined George Rogers Clark because he paid them in Indian bounty. And what I mean by this is On their way to Vincennes, Clark and his men literally raided every Indian village along the way. Many of these were prosperous villages. And what Clark did was simply distribute all of that booty captured from those villages among his men. What that opened up was a stream of backcountry settlers from Virginia coming into Vincennes, settling on indigenous lands, finding that those fertile lands provided great place for growing crops, but people, in order to survive, need more than crops. And so what happened, Clark encouraged his men to attack nearby villages, particularly villages along the Wabash. Vincennes was on the Wabash, to go further north to attack these prosperous villages. And this was a shocking occurrence for indigenous people. It started during the Revolutionary War. Indigenous people were fortunate enough, they just often moved further north or raised sufficient warriors to fend these raiders off. Raiding parties were often no more than 60 or 70 backcountry men who had gone north. Indian forces could easily manage to put together 200 or 300 warriors to protect their village. And this is the period of time at which you begin to see a standoff. The lands north of the Ohio River Valley become referred to as Indian country. Those south of the Ohio River Valley increasingly are seen as American territory.
You know, something that I found really shocking about these raids is that in 1791, George Washington ordered Secretary of War Henry Knox to tell the Kentucky militia that they should not only invade, ransack, and raze these prosperous Native American villages, but they should also kidnap Native women and children. Susan, why would Washington give such an order? I mean, what could be gained by kidnapping Native American women and children?
Part of this is really a throwback to George Washington's previous behavior. During the Revolutionary War, he had authorized Sullivan's raid, and it had basically devastated Seneca villages. It forced the Iroquois to desert the British and to go back and protect their villages. This meant that Washington, in a very sad but smart move, had drawn the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, off of the British back to their villages to protect them. In Washington's mind, he understood, because he had himself been through the Ohio River Valley. He had tried repeatedly at a series of treaties to get Indians north of the Ohio to cede their lands. They refused to come to those treaty conferences to cede those lands. Washington was incredibly frustrated. He had tried unsuccessfully at 3 different treaty conferences to try to get Indians to come to the treaty table to cede their lands. He was desperate to get those lands. He had a growing national debt. In order to decrease that national debt, he had to transform Indian lands into public lands and sell them. This is what was in Washington's mind. Washington, in a sense, did what he did during the American Revolution. He thought it would work in the Wabash River Valley. Why not do what you had done to the Seneca? Go in, destroy their villages, level them to the ground, and there will be no resistance. The difference was profound in the Wabash River Valley. So Washington had sent Harmer north of the Ohio. He had been defeated by Indian people. He had lost half of all the men that were then in the U.S. Army. Indian people were not willing to cede their lands. They were able to resist invasion by U.S. forces. Washington had no love for the Kentucky militia, but he appreciated that they fought in a very nasty, mean way, and he was willing to send them in to try to really level these prosperous villages and to bring Indians to the treaty table. When he sent the Kentucky militia in, what happened is basically Indians fled. They literally fled into the forest. They succeeded in capturing a number of Indian women, 60 the first time. There would be a second invasion, 40 the second time. The first time they managed to really only capture the Indian women that had been left to take care of a number of sick men in their villages. Those villages, those people knew that the Kentucky militia were coming. They vacated their villages. They only left behind the sick, the disabled people that could not flee with them. What basically happened is these are the people the Kentucky militia captured. And they would transfer them to Fort Steuben, which was on the Ohio River, and then eventually those Indian women would be transferred to Fort Washington, Cincinnati post, and they would be kept imprisoned by U.S. forces for a year.
In the long run, what happened to the indigenous prosperity in the Ohio River Valley? Did it ever return after this period of American conquest?
Well, to some extent, Indians remained fairly prosperous for quite a long time. American settlers would have come in. They primarily confiscated Indian lands that were already plowed and settled, but they couldn't get rid of the black swamp. That was a major obstacle, 120 miles long, 40 to 60 miles wide, stretching from Lake Erie. And Indian people, to some extent, moved into the wetlands rather than remaining south of the wetlands. So Indian people, their prosperity was certainly challenged. They didn't have the access to trade goods that they'd had before. One of the things that did happen is that the British did not relinquish control of Detroit nor Michilimackinac until the mid-1790s. And then, to a great extent, Indian people remained in control of most of their lands until the War of 1812. And it would be the War of 1812 that would really begin to see both the demise of the fur trade and the demise of Indian prosperity. Indians, and I want to mention this because I think it's important, one of the trades that took place in the Calumet region, which is outside Chicago, was the black raccoon trade. That made the fur trade remain prosperous for a very long time. You see a lot of people remaining in the Ohio River Valley in wetlands, and they remain to the present day. And if you go into Southwest Michigan, Northwest Indiana, those are still areas that are populated by the descendants of those people who engaged in the fur trade in the 18th century.
Now, Susan, before we move into the time warp, one of the big points you sought to make in indigenous prosperity and American conquest is the need for us to re-examine and reinterpret the American military campaigns in the Ohio River Valley and the Native American response to those campaigns through a gendered lens. Would you tell us about this gendered lens and why you'd like for us to view these events through it?
Well, there are two events that occur in the Ohio River Valley. The first is Harmar's defeat, and the second, a year later, is St. Clair's defeat. After Harmar's defeat is when the Kentucky militia go in to the Wabash River Valley and kidnap Indian women. Those Indian women were imprisoned at Cincinnati for a year. What that did, that imprisonment, that taking of women from their villages, was a message that Indian people in the Great Lakes used throughout the Great Lakes to gather Indian forces in the Ohio River Valley. The Pan-Indian Confederacy, which really takes place under the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Miami Miami being probably one of the more important people in those alliances, they are able to gather and to muster and defeat St. Clair and do so in an incredible way. They draw people, the Ojibwa from the northern Great Lakes, the Cherokee from the south. They are gathering people throughout the Great Lakes to form that Pan-Indian Confederacy. That's what's responsible for St. Clair's defeat. Why do they do that? Why are they so incensed? They are incensed because Washington has had the gall to capture their women and children and to imprison them. And St. Clair's defeat, something that people don't pay much attention to, is that there were so many dead and wounded on the ground that what Indian troops did was to go around and stuff grass and dirt into the mouths of the dead soldiers. That was a signal to American people that the greed for land would be met with armed resistance. And part of that stimulus for that comes from what Washington had done to Indian women. And that's what I mean by seeing events through a gendered lens. I don't want to know about how many men were under Little Turtle or how many men were under St. Clair. The reason why that battle became so fierce and why it took place was because of what Washington had done to Indigenous women. And so that's what I mean by that gendered lens.
Now let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the French had not banned the fur trade in 1697 and had instead remained active in the fur trade? How would the history of the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region be different?
Well, I'm not sure that banning the trade undermined the French that much. I think French men were already marrying into indigenous households. The French were always very disturbed because they always thought French traders looked more like Indians than they did Frenchmen. But what I think the real question is the 7 Years' War. It was inevitable in a sense that the French and the British would clash. The French were interested in trying to curtail British expansion westward, and the British were always interested in controlling a piece of a very lucrative French fur trade, and they were not really interested in being contained by the French. It would be nice to say, well, the French would have continued on, the trade would have allowed them to remain on the continent. Without the population, and the French never sustained an adequate population for them to maintain New France as an equivalent to the population increasing in the British colonies. What the French could have done was to have accepted an indigenous way of life and accepted that Frenchmen were going to look more like Indians and more effectively and diplomatically encouraged Indians to become part of a French alliance. The French never fully did that, and that was really part of the French problem. They had never fully elicited indigenous people as firm allies. The British often from time to time made incursions. And so I don't think there would have been any way for the French to maintain the extensive territory that they exercised or believed they exercised control over without having a substantially larger population.
So, Susan, what comes after indigenous prosperity and American conquest? What aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Well, right now I'm looking at captivity narratives, and I'm looking at them as a means of how indigenous people made their voices heard, but also how captivity narratives have a longer life, of how the United States government has begun to very effectively use captivity narratives to also get their point across, particularly captivity narratives that have occurred during the Iraq War. So I'm trying to bring tools that Indian people used in the 17th century into ways that get adopted by the U.S. government and get now used by the government as tools of war.
And how can we contact you if we have more questions about the Native American history of the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley regions?
Well, the best way to contact me is I'm at the Newberry this year. And if you go to the Newberry website and to the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies, you will find my email there. My email is very easy. It's sleepers@newberry.org. I'm still on my MSU email, but it's harder to reach me that way. The best way is really the McNichol Center at the Newberry Library.
Susan Sleeper Smith, thank you so much for joining us and for taking us through the indigenous prosperity and American conquest of the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes regions.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
During the 17th and 18th centuries, the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region were cosmopolitan and fertile places. They were also Native American spaces. The unique climate of the Ohio River Valley supported 2 growing seasons, which made it possible for Native American women to plant crops twice each year. And the ability to conduct 2 harvests, plus the ability to harvest naturally available fruits, nuts, animals, and fish from the lush river, swamp, and lakelands around them, meant that the Native American peoples who lived in this region typically experienced abundant and prosperous lives. And the fur trades seem to have only added to this prosperity and abundance. The fur trades are what united the Ohio River Valley with the Great Lakes region. As Susan revealed, many Native American peoples who once lived in the Ohio River Valley migrated to trading posts in areas around Green Bay, Wisconsin, in order to take advantage of the fur trades during the 17th century. Now, as Susan noted, there are at least 2 different fur trades to participate in: the beaver trade and the small animal trade. Both of these trades saw Native American men hunt and trap the animals, while Native American women dressed and processed the furs. Now, given their work to provide for their families in terms of growing food, processing furs, and making the clothes they wore, Native American women had a lot of say in what goods their families traded their furs for. And thanks to Susan, we can see how the French records reveal that the goods Native Americans most desired were not guns, alcohol, or metal tools, but cloth. Yes, Native Americans traded their furs for those other goods too, but what they really wanted was cotton, linen, and other cloth that they could easily transform into comfortable clothes. Which is why the French made sure that 75% of the trade goods they stocked at Detroit constituted various types of cloth, and why cloth accounted for more than 65% of the trade goods they stocked at Green Bay, and for more than 55% of the trade goods they stocked at Weohtanon. The Native American need and demand for cloth is partly why it seems so shocking to Native Americans that the French would close their fur trade operations in 1697. Now, the end of the French trade didn't see Native American people starving, but it did see them seeking an alternative outlet for which they could exchange their furs for cloth. And this search for an alternative outlet is what brought many Native peoples back to the Ohio River Valley, where they were able to grow a prosperous trade with the British. Now, the fur trades brought Europeans into Native American spaces and places. But as Susan stated, even by the 7 Years' War, you'd find that Europeans were still greatly outnumbered in the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region by Native Americans. And part of the reason for this demographic disparity is because Native Americans determined how and where they would interact with Europeans. They simply resisted all non-approved European incursions into their places and spaces. And we can see this with Pontiac's rebellion. Native Americans didn't want the British in their territory. So between 1763 and 1766, they launched a pan-Indian rebellion which placed 12 British forts under siege and saw 8 of those forts fall to Native American warriors. It was really only during the period of American conquest that we begin to see a change in the demographics of the region. Native Americans largely ignored the capture of Vincennes by George Rogers Clark in 1779, and it was this inaction that opened the door to American conquest. Clark's invasion started a trend. Backcountry Virginians and Kentucky militiamen would invade the Ohio River Valley and plunder and raze Native American villages. But since the region was so lush and so vast, most Native Americans simply avoided and evaded American insurgents by relocating elsewhere in the region. But after American independence, it simply wasn't enough to move away from the Americans anymore. Achieving independence had come at a steep financial cost, and to pay down its war debt, the new United States government sought to sell land that was unoccupied by white farmers to white farmers. And by the 1790s, the government really needed to convert the Native American spaces of the Ohio River Valley into American spaces. So to achieve this end, President George Washington took drastic action. Washington knew the Native American peoples of the Ohio River Valley would not surrender their lands peacefully, quietly, or without resistance. So he ordered Secretary of War Henry Knox to employ harsh tactics. He ordered Knox to send in the Kentucky militia with orders to plunder and burn villages and to kidnap women and children so that, in the end, they could force Native American warriors to capitulate. This tactic brought on a very fierce war, a war that Native Americans won at the start, and a war that you can hear more about in greater detail in episode 29 with Colin Calloway. But over time, the Americans prevailed, and the Ohio River Valley became a bifurcated territory, with its southern parts becoming an American space and its northern parts continuing on as a Native space. Native Americans continued to make the most out of their spaces. They continued to participate in the fur trade, and they continued to use the lands around them to produce bountiful harvests. So even after American conquest began, indigenous prosperity continued. It wasn't really until after the War of 1812 that indigenous prosperity in the region began to seriously decline. But that's a story for another episode. Look for more information about Susan, her book, Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/223. The Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona College facilitates the study of Thomas Paine's writings, life, and legacy. For more information about its interesting work and events, be sure to follow the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies on Twitter at the ITPS. That's at the ITPS. Don't forget that friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. In fact, it's really an act of kindness when you share your favorite podcasts with others. Because not only will your friends appreciate the information about something they might really enjoy, but your favorite podcasters will also benefit as you help spread the word about your favorite shows. Production assistance for this episode came from my Omohundro Institute Digital Projects teammate, Holly White. Thank you, Holly. Finally, we covered a lot of history in this episode, and I wonder what you found to be the most interesting bit. Was it the fact that we should think about the fur trade as the cloth trade? The fact that women did a lot of the work to make indigenous prosperity in the region a reality? Or perhaps why the tactics in the Battle of the Wabash became so fierce? There is so much to choose from here, and I'm really curious about what you think, so please let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.